Thanks, John, for coming.
Thank you, Sally. I'm with it. I don't know whether I'll get back to that stool or not, but thank you, Sally, for inviting me here tonight. Place I haven't been here for several years. A wonderful building. But my first thought is what a wonderful advocate that Sally is for all things Wilmington, if not all things Delaware. So thank you again for doing that. And she was, as she said, she was there when the rowing club kind of got out on the river, and has been a great promoter and friend of the rowing clubs. So that's my other life. And thank you all again. See some familiar faces in the crowd. I left some things on the table. We handed out the brochures, which again focus on my grandfather's photography, but also on the table, you'll see the 2-volume Catalogue Raisonné, which is a complete compendium of all my grandfather's work, all his published and landscape work. Who was I talking about? Landscapes, you sir. And that's kind of the foundation and academic explanation of my grandfather's entire oeuvre or work. It weighs 12 pounds. It took 10 years to produce that. So it took about £1 a year from 1999 to 2009. So every work is in there, and I hope you'll take a look at it. We're very proud of that. And my sister, I hope, is watching from Zoom land, Louise. And hello, Zoom land. Folks, thank you for joining us. So she's actually sort of so one of the editors of the Catalogue Raisonné, and she's sort of my coach when it comes to these presentations, because she does them all the way out west. But this is just kind of a sort of a short overview of my grandfather's other extraordinary talent, and that was as a photographer. And when we were doing all this research, and mostly at the Delaware Art Museum, it was quite evident that he used his photography as kind of a medium to, I would say, substantiate, to help create his illustrations. He wouldn't be the first artist to do that. Thomas Eakins did it. Winslow Homer did it. But they would use the photographs as a sort of as a tool, as a compositional tool. Sounds very simple, but in order to do that, you had to go where the story was. And my grandfather was, excuse me, there goes the voice, was commissioned often to go visit and stay at places that he was writing stories about. Well, at the turn of the century, many of the stories were muckraking stories about child labor. Who was I thinking of? Who the most famous one was? Thank you. I wrote a note on that. It's in here. Upton Sinclair was one of the original muckrakers. So my grandfather would go out, take all these. He took his camera everywhere he went. The only thing we don't have is a picture of my grandfather with his camera. But we do have the camera, the primary camera he used. So even though he was keeping a complete alphanumeric diary of all 2,500 paintings, we found out that he in fact had kept an alphanumeric boxes, organizations, collations of all his photographs, all 4,200. There were also the negatives at the Delaware Art Museum. That's a long story, but to make it shorter, when we dove into this project about 5 years ago, we realized the negatives were nitrate negatives. The Delaware Art Museum wasn't aware of that they were being stored there. They thought they'd given them to Hagley. So when we discovered they were nitrate negatives, phone calls and what have you, we kept the fire company farther away as we could because nitrate negatives can kaboom. So Hagley came to the rescue and took all the glass plate, all the nitrate negatives, all the early 1x1 negatives, and has digitized them, scanned them, and they're all on the Hagley website. So you have this marvelous archives of the original prints, beautifully organized thanks to the Delaware Art Museum. And then at Hagley, all the negatives. And they're all organized too. So we've got tremendous material to work with. And working with Bill Cohen, another good friend of mine, PhD, it also became quite obvious that my grandfather was in fact a photojournalist. He wouldn't have thought himself as that, but by using his camera so often, so many places he went, he captured the lives of all these American people at work, at play, especially the coal mines and silk mills. And these photographs are testament to the early life of the early industrial United States. And we're going to try and convince our readers in the book, and there are two sort of samples of the book back there through about 17 chapters, which actually include a trip he took with Mr. Sellers in Europe for about a month and a half. And he took his camera all these places in Europe. So now we just have to identify them. We know where he was, we just got to identify him. So there's a lot of archival digging in all these photographs. So what I'm going to kind of go through is just sort of some fun examples, sort of to give you the other side of Frank Schoonover. And you'll see some comparatives where the illustration follows right on the heels of the photograph. And interestingly enough, the photograph follows the text because the illustration had to obviously relate to the story in McClure's or Harper's or Scribner's. And you'll see that here. So I have my great helper here. Thanks to Sally, we got the right gizmo to get this going. I'm going to use a little pointer. Hopefully this will be helpful to you. And you'll see this opening slide through his own lens. Well, I thought that was really a very interesting title, preliminary title for the book. And then an Andy Warhol publication was recently published titled Through His Own Lens, because he was a photographer. So I don't know what we're going to do about that, but anyhow, so we start out just as the opening with the Breaker Boys in Hazleton, PA, 1902. You'll see another example of this. These are the young fellows that went down to the coal mines for about 10 cents a day for 10 hours a day and sorted the slate from the coal. And you get a little better feel for that as we go on. But that's kind of the theme of this presentation because it's probably the most compelling examples of my grandfather's photographs, all black and white. Later on, he hand colored some of his lantern slides. So this is 1902, and we'll start out. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the great studios on Rodney Street, which almost look that good today. You had Harvey Dunn, Pyle student, South Dakota, Peck and Ashley, N.C. Wyeth, Frank Schoonover, 1906. They're a quick story. So Ashley and Peck were there for a while. Ashley stuck around Wilmington. Peck went off to New England. Clifford Ashley, his grandson, came to visit me last Saturday from New Hampshire. And he said, oh my gosh, this is where it all happened. And I said, yes. So he was enthralled. So we were kind of bosom buddies for an afternoon, talking grandson talk. But he's just beginning his search. Mine started 40 years ago. So, but maybe he'll catch up. But I'm so glad he's doing that. Ashley wrote the Book of Knots, Knots, for you mariners out there. All right, so N.C. Wyeth was in Studio 3 for 3 years, and then off to Chas Ford, 1908. And that story's still being told today. Okay. So inside the studio, and I'm there every day. You're welcome to visit. This is 1910. This is now, you notice the Georgia plantation desk hasn't moved an inch since 1906. So I've tried to keep it very representative of my grandfather's 60 years in the studio. Although in the summers, he went up to Bushkill, Pennsylvania, painted a lot of those landscapes. And then today, this is a pano. They love these phones from one side to the other. It's sort of a living museum, art and gallery, research center. So that's when you walk in, and please do. I'll be sitting at this right back there. Okay, well, and in the corner, you'll see this this exhibit referring to grandfather's photographs, the Breaker Boys, and then the camera, and then this to kind of give people a little quick insight into that talent of his. Okay. That's great. There's the camera, Kodak Model 4. I can't believe it's still in the studio. It's just remarkable. It ought to probably be in the Smithsonian or the Eastman Kodak Museum. And next, now, how do I know anything more about that camera? Because of my grandfather's, besides all the diaries and the day books, he kept an accounting record of everything. So we will find Trenton, Eastman, where to go? There it is. Camera, 3 1/4 by 4 1/4, $10. So, and then where'd he go to? Hazleton, Mahoning City, Shenandoah, up in the Scranton area, headed off to the coal mines, 1902. And then various things, including the studio rent, $12. That was not, however, back then the Schoonover Studios, he was down at 8th and just off 8th and Market Street. Okay. All right. So here's a wonderful photograph of my grandfather just arriving at the coal mines, all set to go. Obviously, he did not take this photograph, nor the one almost 50 years later in the studio with his right elbow on a camera that he never used, that a fellow brought to the studio on a Sunday and said, "I'll be back if you'll let me use your studio on Sundays to take photographs." And he hasn't come back in about 80 years. So I've donated that wonderful view camera to the Soul Biggs Museum down in Dover, since they have a little gallery, Frankie Schoonover Gallery, American Illustration. And that's a good home for it for now. Okay. So here we are assessing Frank Schoonover, social documentary photographer. And that argument, if you want to call it that, that overview will be intensely, I would say, written, but by Bill Cohen, who's a PhD, and argued, I would say, by him. And there won't be much doubt about it. They're the girls in the silk mills. Now, mind you, all their husbands were working in the coal mines across the street, not more than 2 miles away, generally, because the kids came out of the coal mine, and then as the miners aged out, and they became the miners or died, and these gals went over to the cotton mills. And so there was, and of course, generations of immigrants, the Polish, German, and just sweet, wonderful girls, except for she's just not too happy. I have another picture of her that's just to die for. Okay. These are just another example of his record keeping. These are actually negative, tiny negative envelopes about the size of a number 10 envelope, and his writing F in bed. That's grandfather in bed, F in the backyard, Frank in the sitting room, Frank. Oh gosh, some standing by something in the park. These again give us so much important information about these tiny. Now we don't know what camera he used, but we have the negatives. So they will be part of the Trenton Ford story in the beginning of the book. But just wonderful record keeping. Notice the YMCA, that was in Trenton, New Jersey. Okay. And so here we are in Trenton, which is near Oxford, which is where my grandfather was born. And that's my grandfather and his sister, Hallie, about 1896. Besides being wonderful family photographs, you go, well, what else? Well, here's what else. I can tell you that Hallie took this photograph because I can see the shadow of her little blouse. So that again provides us information we wouldn't normally have. And grandfather obviously took this photograph, tell by his skinny neck and his elbow there. A day in the park, okay? And here, right outside of Trenton, is a really fascinating photograph of baptism in the Delaware, 1899. Obviously a very significant ceremony. And he's probably in his boat because he spent a lot of time on the Delaware River. And as far as I can tell, that's upriver. And the Delaware was one of his favorite places growing up. And then when he went over to Bushkill, spending a lot of time on the Delaware. So we'll study this a little more. But then again, it's a lifestyle kind of photograph, but a very interesting one. Okay. All right, back to the coal breakers. This obviously tells you the story. There's a village. I haven't identified this breaker. There were 200 breakers back in those days. But I love the cow. So the kids would be inside there and the coal would come up and go down that chute. Just the coal and the slate would be siphoned off otherwise. There's actually a story, a movie about the breakers with Sean Connery called the Molly Mcguires. I watched it not long ago. And they've got a breaker they built, looks just like that. Okay. Kind of shows you how desolate, yeah. And another view of the breaker, again, the railroad car tells us a lot of information, just what's written on the back. We're still trying to identify this breaker, okay? Up in Hazleton, all right? And here's just a much more dramatic picture. Now, my grandfather took this photograph at night with a flash. And you can just tell because of the eyes and the shadows and the reflections off the wall. But this is the Breakers Boys. The Breakers Boys had just gone on strike, if you can believe that, and unionized, and say they were having a meeting. And there's tremendous history about that. And we'll include a fair amount of that in our essays. So grandfather was up there for nine days, taking all these photographs, writing the story, by the way, The Children of the Coal Shadows. And that was a muckraking story about the hardships of the young breaker boys. And they're wearing their oil lamps up on their head. Now, here's what's funny. Next photograph. There's my grandfather's original charcoal for the story. The Children of the Coal Shadow. But he did not include the oil lamps. There are none there. But he did put some scribble on the blackboard. And I think he put some math on there. That's not good. I've got a C in math. But all that just is this is a marvelous example of his using the photographs, even though now we realize the photograph had that extra importance. Okay. Boy, could he draw too. All right. All right. So back to the coal mines. They're the breaker boys looking a little worse for wear. I don't know how he got them to stop for a minute. There's the chute going down. And the boss man is up there, right there. He was not a friendly guy. So now we'll go to the next one. And there's another photograph of the same group of boys on one side. And there's the charcoal. And in the back, you can barely see it, is the boss man who's probably got a shovel with him. And that's all from that story, The Children of the Cold Shadows. Okay. Yeah. Pardon? They would, the coal, they would sit there. They didn't even have gloves on. And the coal would come down, but there was slate interspersed, and they'd have to pick that slate out as it went by and remove it just all day long. Which obviously led to a really miserable day and very difficult on their young bodies. And this is just a photograph, obviously, the coal mining town up there. And we'll probably blow this up. And there's a little family standing there. And there's, I think that's a cow doing there, hanging out. And I wonder if that's a water tower. Just not sure how the water gets back down. But some of these, even these sort of the archaeology and the architecture, these photographs is really fascinating. And obviously you have an old creek here. Okay. One of the boys gives you another look at the housing in the coal mines. I included quite a few of these, okay? This one I love, Three Musketeers, so to speak. Just gives you an idea of the whole social fabric, the dressing, etc. of these guys going to work. And they have all their, that's a big saw there. I love the hats though. Can't imagine going to work in a hat like that. Okay. We presume maybe father and son. And he's got his little sort of picnic thing there. Probably has water in it. Now he's obviously been down the mine. Okay. And here's the Breaker Boys boss. That was also in the article, the Children of the Cold Shadow, and kind of a mean looking fella. Small charcoal, probably about 10 by 10 inches. And all these, of course, all these illustrations are recorded in the day books. Now I threw this in because this is Louis Hine. Louis Hine is probably one of the most famous muckraking photographers and social documentary photographers of that period. Very, very well known. Most of his photographs are in the Smithsonian. And you can see, I just threw this in as a comparison. Breaker Boys at Work, South Pittston, Pennsylvania, 1911. So you have obviously other efforts by photographers and obviously muckraking authors to tell the story about these young fellows. And here you'll see the coal is going right underneath their feet. Okay. There's a just extraordinary sort of bird's eye view of the whole the whole emporium. Mine hard at work, all the industrial energy that you expect to see turn of the century. So what my grandfather did, he took a piece of this right down here. All right, next slide. And he created this marvelous charcoal and watercolor of the women in the silk mills having lunch. And notice down there is a little vignette of that photograph with the train. However, different story. And there's little touches of red that my grandfather's noted for his little little touches of watercolor, sometimes wax crayon. I have this hanging in my house. Okay. Now we're sort of between the coal mines and the silk mills. This is my grandfather's Mona Lisa, I think. Just such a poignant photograph of all these children, young boy, and they're basically the children of the families in these coal mines and silk mills. Wonderful fellow there, but just almost angelic, really, when you consider the conditions of the day. Okay, another one of my favorites. This is two of the ladies in the silk mills. He did not do an illustration of this, but the story in Harper's by Frances Sandville. She wrote about this. Women in the Pennsylvania silk mills. She and her sister went up there, and her sister disguised herself as a worker and got inside the mines to spend a day or two documenting the experience. And so then they commissioned Harper's commissioned my grandfather to go back up there, and he did all these photographs of the silk mills. But what's remarkable is how kind of enchanting this photograph is. And the women obviously weren't working like the poor young boys and the breakers, but they did work into the night often, and heavily disciplined, heavily supervised, underpaid, of course, but lovely women. Okay. So now we're going to sort of branch off a little bit. This is on his way to Denver to actually take photographs for a story about the Denver copper mines in Butte, Montana. And this is just another one of those sort of charming photographs that he took on the way. That was 1905. Then he went into New York, did a story called The Judgment of the Steerage, when a boat, Koning Louise, came and docked in New York. My grandfather went up there and took photographs of all the steerage. And those were all part of his illustrations for that story, The Judgment of the Steerage. And we were able to find the actual time when the boat came in and the manifest. So we know all 396 names of all the passengers, but be very difficult to determine these folks, mostly Italian, some Portuguese. Okay. Sort of coming to the end here, actually. Hudson Bay Company went up in 1911. He had been there in 1903. There aren't as many photographs as the 1903 trip, but the ones that are tell of a 4-month expedition in 20 to 50 degree below zero weather. Fortunately, he went back in the summer up to the Hudson Bay, HBC, Hudson Bay Company, and he wrote stories about his travels up there, and he illustrated many, many stories of by Canadian writers. about life in the Canadian wilderness up in Hudson Bay. This is what's called the Fur Brigade. Okay, I think we're gonna finish. I threw this in because I had the birch bark canoe. I was a little remiss in not getting the illustration of the fur trappers, but this is very typical of Schoonover. I'm just switching to the illustration. Very typical popular magazine, probably about 1921, and sort of a reminiscent of my grandfather's fishing trips, especially up to Canada. And then it can become a cover of the magazine. These are very popular pulp magazines in the 20s and 30s, even into the 40s. Okay. Well, there's a perfect ending because there's my grandfather with yet another camera, and my grandmother who did not like being photographed. This is probably up in Rockport, where they love to go in the later summers. Not sure who took this photograph, but it's just a wonderful, again, family photograph. But it just shows you how he had that camera with him everywhere he went. So I think that's the when you have 4,500 of these photographs, you don't dare show them all. But you'll see a few more in the two sample books that I have published. I just did that on Shutterfly, but we'll continue to research at the Delaware Art Museum in Hagley through the fall. And then next year will be, if we're lucky, will get us to press, even though the Oak Knoll Books, who published the Catalogue Raisonné, I talked to recently, said, John, it's a lovely idea, but you have to understand the price of publishing went up 48% in the last month. So just make sure you got a little bit of cash. But we've been very lucky through our Schoonover Fund to get wonderful, wonderful contributions to the ongoing research as they did for the Catalogue Raisonné. And there it is. Any questions? I sort of focused on that. No, we didn't do.
If anybody has a question, either you can come up or I will take the microphone to you, because otherwise the people on Zoom can't hear the questions.
Oh, okay.
So any questions from this audience? Yeah.
Did he was commissioned to do a lot of this work? Did he use photography to supplement his income, or was it just a side that he?
Some of his photographs were actually published in McClure's magazine for this 1906 Denver Butte, Montana dispute with some judges, probably not much different from today. And they were actually published, and there were some photographs published in stories like American Boy magazine about my grandfather's Canadian travels. But in general, no, they were just part of his sort of support mechanism. Now, he used photographs in his studio models. They come in, and he'd use that for Indians, cowboys, even rowers. And he developed a lot of photographs, and he sent them to Eastman Kodak, but he made notations of that. But he actually started developing his photographs in the mill in Chadds Ford in 1898 when he was studying with Pyle out there, because he was writing his brother in Trenton letters. That's been our biggest source of information, is letters. Really remarkable. So, yeah. No, the photographs are not for sale. Don't think we've thought about, quote, marketing. We might do a special edition, maybe the coal mines. we have several galleries and the Delaware Art Museum and the bigs saying, when you get the book done, we want to do a photography show, and it will be really extraordinary, really, because then all the photographs have to be professionally printed, but that's fine. That's our goal, is to kind of finish with an appropriate exhibit.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Excuse me, are the letters, some of the letters being published in the book too?
There'll be exactly, there'll be a lot of references, and then there's maybe some little caption parts in there. But then when you read the essay, it'll refer to letters, and all those letters are at the Delaware Art Museum, are publicly available. Delaware Art Museum has a marvelous library. Rachel down there has been so supportive, and we did lose a couple of years, obviously, so we're just sort of picking up the steam. But I appreciate just an evening like this to kind of, talk more about it and spread the word, so to speak.
I was wondering, did you ever get to know your grandfather or speak with him about his work?
Wonderful question. Not often enough, because we lived in Middletown and he lived in Wilmington, and it seemed like a long way away, especially in a 49 Dodge, when you were trying to get to Wilmington and the automatic transmission didn't work, or a 51 Chevy. Thanksgiving, Christmas, back and forth. And then after I got out of college, up to Wilmington, where my grandfather was doing fine, but having sort of Wednesday night, Sadie, you'll appreciate this, Wednesday night sort of salons. And I would go there, and it's just hundreds of paintings. Never thought about photographs. And people would come in and say, Frank, how much for one of these? Oh, $75. What do you think? And out they went. And a lot of paintings went then, but not enough time beyond that. When he was, after he had a stroke in 1969, he was comfortable for 2 or 3 years. But no, you never ask enough questions. But I do remember him carving a turkey, as I remember most.
Did his books, like on the Breaker Boys, have political influence at the time?
I mean, those publications slowly, I think the Upton Sinclair you mentioned, his thing about the meat packing was very, very impactful. But I didn't mention the silk mills. That stirred up that story, the women in Pennsylvania silk mills, to the point where Roosevelt, who was a great champion of the muckrakers, went to the silk mills and through that visit tried to get legislation created. So definitely there was a good reason for all that journalism. Yeah, and my grandfather now becomes a part of that as we look back and back and back. So all's good there. Yeah, but it takes a lot. So I was just looking at the photographs. Excuse me. You got to reach into the history, like the books on the coal mines, for instance, and muckraking in general. So one other thing, there's a chapter on auto races in Scranton, where the women are all just beautifully dressed, and this dirt raceway just standing there. It's not NASCAR, but that photograph just tells you, the sort of the social conditions of the time. So hang with us. We'll get those chapters done. There's even one on the circus in Wilmington. He went to the circus, and the gypsies, he went and photographed outside of Wilmington. So there's a little local history too. Really fascinating.
Any Zoom questions?
Okay, so your sister made a comment, Louise Smith, and she says that that grandfather lived with a miner's family while in Hazelton. So I'm sure we would love to hear a little more about that if you know anything. And the other thing that we have gotten over Zoom is that we would like to invite you to the Archives Craft Shop Museum here in Arden. And it includes, you know, a lot of the history of the Ardens. And we have a member of the museum right here. Anyway.
Any more questions from the audience? You have one.
In the first photograph of the boys sitting in the first photograph, sort of in the middle, there was a boy there. I was wondering if that young boy was African American or was he just dark because he soot from the coal mine?
Oh. Onion play. Yeah, there's a, you know, up there a broad range of ethnicity, if you're going to say that. Yeah, back. Okay, hit play. Oh, no, I doubt that. But we go back to the drawing. No, as I say, they're mostly the, I guess they were sort of Slavic, maybe immigrants, German. There might be some just, in the history of this whole era of the coal mines, there might be a better, better research on the mining families. Yeah. No, yeah. Oh, no, he would be generally responding to the text of the galley proofs that said to him. He had this whole story, and he'd see a sentence, and he'd pick a very relative drawing that relates to what the story was trying to say. He couldn't just sort of paint something without the text having some input. But there are a lot of faces there, and yeah, right there. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard to tell, but Just an empty group. Okay, how are those Zoomers doing? Time room. Well, thank you. I just appreciate your. I haven't done this for a while, so kind of actually I did one in outside of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. They called and said, "Now your grandfather was a fisherman. He knew Zane Grey. Come on up." And so I had to do only his illustrations with fishing in them. Maybe you saw one. You saw one there. So that was an interesting kind of little focus on the illustrations, as opposed to pirates or Indians or cowboys or Treasure Island. It's my grandfather. The wealth of his work is just absolutely extraordinary. I mean, his whole life, and the record keeping he continued throughout. Amazing. So we'll leaf through the Catalogue Raisonné. That'll tell you a lot of the story.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I'm sure John will be around for questions if you want to talk to him, look at his books, and we'll hopefully see you next month for an evening of American chess.